The day Gilbert Thatcher rode into Harlan Creek, the sky above the Kansas plains was the color of a bruise, purple and heavy, with the kind of heat that made horses mean and men meaner. And the last thing he expected to find was a woman who would change the entire course of his life. Harlan Creek, Kansas, in the summer of 1878, was not a town that inspired poetry. It sat low along a bend in a muddy tributary that barely deserved to call itself a creek, its main street a stretch of hard-packed dirt flanked by a general store, a saloon that smelled of old tobacco and regret, a church with a leaning steeple, a livery stable, and a scattering of homes that ranged from modest to barely standing. The town had once hoped to become something, back when the railroad surveys had come through and men with brass buttons and leather ledgers had walked the land and talked about futures. But the railroad went south, following a more favorable grade, and Harlan Creek had been left to dry like a cut apple in the sun. Gilbert had been riding for 3 weeks when he arrived. He was 28 years old, broad through the shoulders, with hands that were calloused from years of ranch work and a jaw that was shadowed with several days of trail growth. He had blue-gray eyes that people tended to remember, not because they were particularly striking in the way of a painting, but because they were unusually still, like a man who had learned early that looking carefully at the world cost nothing and saved you a great deal of trouble. He wore a plain brown hat that had seen better decades, boots that had been resoled twice, and a single-action Colt on his right hip that he had not fired in anger in 4 years, a fact he was quietly proud of. He had come to Harlan Creek not because he had chosen it with any great deliberation, but because his horse, a strawberry-roan mare named Clover, had thrown a shoe 2 miles east of town, and he had walked her in rather than risk lameness on the hard summer ground. He had money enough for the farrier and a meal, and perhaps a night in a proper bed, though the last was a luxury he had been doing without for long enough that a bedroll under open stars had started to feel like the natural order of things. The farrier, a heavy-set man named Dabrowski, told him it would be afternoon before the shoe was ready, as he had 2 other horses ahead of Clover and a broken wheel rim that someone had paid him in advance to fix before those horses. Gilbert thanked him without complaint, settled his mare in a stall with fresh water and hay, and walked out into the main street of Harlan Creek to find something to eat and somewhere to sit out of the sun. That was when he first saw the house. He almost walked past it. It sat at the very edge of town, on the south side of the main street, separated from the general store by a gap of maybe 30 feet of bare dirt. Calling it a house was generous. It was more accurately a structure that had been a house at some point, and was now engaged in a slow negotiation with gravity about its continued standing. The wood of the exterior walls had gone gray, and was splitting along the grain in several places. The front window had no glass, only a piece of canvas tacked across it to keep out the weather, and the canvas had a tear in it that let in a blade of morning sun. The roof on the left side dipped in a way that suggested one of the support beams inside had given way. The front door was open, propped that way with what appeared to be a smooth river stone, and through the doorway came the smell of something cooking, something simple but real, cornmeal and maybe a little salt pork. Gilbert might have passed it entirely if not for the sound. He heard singing first, a low and unself-conscious melody, a woman's voice that carried the quality of someone singing not for an audience, but because the song was the only company she had. Then he heard a child laugh, quick and bright like a struck bell, and then he heard something crash inside and the singing stopped. He was already moving toward the door before he had made a deliberate decision to do so. He knocked on the open door frame with his knuckle, 3 light raps, and called out, "Hello in there. Everything all right?" There was a pause, and then a woman appeared at the doorway, and Gilbert Thatcher felt the world tilt sideways in a way it had never done before, not in 28 years of living. Marcella Grayson was 25 years old, and she was the kind of beautiful that did not announce itself, that crept up on you slowly and then landed all at once like a warm hand on the back of your neck. She had dark hair, nearly black, pinned up in a way that suggested it had been neatly arranged at the start of the morning, but that the morning had long since won several small battles against her efforts. Her eyes were a deep brown, the color of good creek water over clean stone, and they were sharp and cautious, and tired in the way of someone who had been managing things alone for a long time. Her dress was clean but faded to an indistinct blue-gray, patched at the left elbow with a slightly different fabric, and she had flour on her left cheek, and what appeared to be a small amount of something purple, possibly berry juice, on her right wrist. She looked at him with those careful brown eyes and said, "I am fine, thank you. My son knocked a pot off the hook." Her voice was composed and direct, with none of the apologetic flutter that some women used around strangers, as though the very fact of her circumstances required apology. She offered him none. Behind her, peering around her skirt with enormous dark eyes, was a boy of perhaps 4 or 5 years, with his mother's dark hair and a scratch on his chin that looked recent. "The name is Gilbert Thatcher," he said, removing his hat. "I am just passing through. My horse threw a shoe and I am waiting on the farrier. I did not mean to intrude." She studied him for a moment with that frank, measuring gaze. "Marcella Grayson," she said, "and this is my son Eli." The boy pressed further into her skirt at the sound of his name. "How do you do, Eli?" Gilbert said, bending slightly at the waist and addressing the boy with the same seriousness he would have offered an adult. Children, in his experience, knew when they were being talked down to, and they remembered it. Eli blinked at him, then said, "You have a very big hat." "It is a very big, son," Gilbert said, and the boy considered this and apparently found it satisfactory, because he stepped out from behind his mother and looked at Gilbert with open curiosity. Marcella watched this exchange with an expression that was nearly a smile but kept itself just short of one. "Are you hungry, Mr. Thatcher?" she asked. "I have cornbread and a little salt pork on. It is not much." He started to decline out of reflex, the way a man did when offered things by people who clearly had little to spare, but something in the way she asked it, with a kind of quiet dignity that made it clear she was not asking out of obligation, but out of genuine hospitality that she had preserved even at the cost of everything else, made him reconsider. "I would be grateful," he said, "if you will let me do something useful in return. I noticed your doorstep could use a bit of work, and I am handy enough with a hammer." She looked at the crumbling front step, then back at him. "I do not have a hammer," she said, "but the farrier might lend you one." "Then I will go ask him," Gilbert said. She fed him first. He sat at a small table inside the dim, tidy interior of the house, Eli across from him with his small hands wrapped around a cup of water, and Marcella stood at the fire and ladled out portions with the careful economy of someone who had measured food for a long time. The cornbread was good, dense, and a little sweet, and the salt pork was cooked soft, and the whole thing was simple and real and nourishing in a way that food eaten alone on the trail never quite managed to be. Gilbert ate slowly and listened as Eli explained to him, at considerable length, the full history of a small carved wooden horse that he kept on the windowsill. It had been made by his grandfather, the boy explained, his grandfather on his father's side, and his grandfather had been a very tall man who knew the name of every tree. "Your father's father," Gilbert said, and then let the sentence hang there, light and undemanding. "My father went away," Eli said, in the matter-of-fact way of a child who has been given the truth in its simplest form and accepted it as simply. "He went to work on the cattle drive, and then there was a flood on the Red River and he did not come back." Gilbert looked at Marcella, who was standing at the fire with her back to him, and he saw the slight tension across her shoulders. "I am sorry to hear that," he said, to Eli and to the room in general. "Mama says he loved us very much," Eli said. "I believe that," Gilbert said. After they ate, Gilbert walked to the farrier's, borrowed a hammer and a handful of nails, found several scrap boards behind the general store that the proprietor, a thin man named Huckett, let him have for nothing after Gilbert explained the situation, and spent the better part of 2 hours repairing the front step of Marcella Grayson's house. Eli sat on the ground nearby and offered commentary and handed Gilbert nails with great seriousness, each one delivered with both hands and a focused expression, as though the nails were rare and precious objects that required careful transfer. Marcella appeared in the doorway partway through with a cup of water for each of them, and she stood there for a moment watching Gilbert work, and he was aware of her watching but kept his attention on the boards and the hammer and let her draw whatever conclusions she chose. When the step was done, it was solid. Not fine work, not the kind you would point out to a visitor, but work that would hold for years and that a person could stand on without worry. Gilbert set the hammer down and stood back and looked at it, and Eli looked at it and said, "It does not wobble any more." "It does not," Gilbert agreed. He returned the hammer to Dabrowski and found that Clover was ready, shod and watered, and in better spirits for the rest and the hay. He paid what was owed, thanked the man, and stood in the afternoon light of the main street of Harlan Creek with a horse ready to travel and no particular reason to stay. He told himself he was only going back to say goodbye and to thank Marcella Grayson properly. He told himself that as he walked back down the street and knocked again on the door frame. She answered with a smear of new flour on her wrist, which told him she was making supper already, and she looked at him with those careful brown eyes and said, "Is your horse ready?" "She is," he said. "I came to thank you for the meal," Marcella nodded. "You fixed my step, Mr. Thatcher. We are even." "The nails and boards cost nothing," he said. "The meal cost you something." "Not as much as you might think," she said, and there was something in the way she said it that was not pride and not self-pity but something in between, a simple accounting of the facts of her life that she neither inflated nor diminished. He stood there another moment, hat in hand, and said something that surprised even himself. "Is there anything else that needs doing? Before I go," she looked at him steadily. "You do not owe me anything, Mr. Thatcher." "I know that," he said. "I am asking because there are things that need doing and I have the afternoon." A long pause. The hot, dry wind moved down the street and lifted a small curl of hair that had come loose from her pin and laid it across her cheek, and she did not move to push it aside, only stood there considering him with a look that was guarded and thoughtful and slightly something else that she had it well trained not to show. "The pump handle," she said finally. "It sticks. I have to use 2 hands, and in the winter with the cold it is nearly impossible." "Show me," he said. He fixed the pump handle, which required taking it apart and cleaning the mechanism, which was clogged with mineral deposits, and then reassembling it with a worn washer replaced by a piece of leather cut from a scrap he found in the livery. He also, because he noticed it, rehung the front door so that it swung clean instead of dragging on the left side. He patched the tear in the canvas over the window with a piece of oilcloth he bought at the general store with his own money, which he did quickly and without making mention of it, so that Marcella would find out only when she looked at the window. By the time the sun was dropping toward the flat western horizon and painting the Kansas plain in shades of copper and rose, Gilbert had done 5 small repairs to the Poorest home in Harlan Creek, and he was aware in a way that was both deeply comfortable and deeply inconvenient that he did not want to leave it. He put his tools away and washed his hands at the pump, the repaired handle moving smooth and easy under his palm, and Marcella appeared in the doorway again and said, "You should stay for supper." It was not a question. It was not quite an invitation in the usual sense. It was said in the direct and unhurried voice of a woman who had thought about it and decided, and he recognized a quality in it that he had been aware of all day, that this was not a woman who said things she did not mean, that every word out of her mouth cost something and was therefore chosen with care. "I would like that very much," he said. Supper was beans cooked long with a ham hock and more cornbread, and it was better than anything he had eaten in weeks on the trail. And he sat at that small table in the dim warmth of that falling-down house, while Eli told him about a turtle he had found in the creek last spring, and the arguments he had had with his mother about keeping it. And Marcella ate across the table with a quiet half-smile listening to her son, and the lamplight made everything amber and close and real. After Eli was put to bed, a process that involved two separate stories and a negotiation about the wooden horse that Gilbert listened to from the other side of the interior wall with something warm and unexplained moving through his chest, Marcella came back to the table and poured 2 cups of coffee that was more chicory than coffee but was hot and honest, and she sat down across from him and looked at him with the direct gaze she had been using all day and said, "Where are you headed, Mr. Thatcher?" "Colorado," he said. "There is work on a ranch outside of Pueblo. A man named Corvin who runs cattle up into the high country in summer. I wrote to him in the spring and he said to come." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "How long have you been drifting?" He considered the word. "4 years," he said, "since my father's ranch went under." "What happened to it?" "Drought," he said. 3 dry years and then a 4th that was drier. We sold what we could and my father paid back what he owed to the bank and to the neighbors and to the men who had worked for him, and then there was nothing left. He and my mother went to live with my sister in Missouri. I went west." She nodded slowly. "And you like it, the going west?" He looked down at his cup. "I like the work," he said honestly. "I know cattle, I know land, I know what needs doing and how to do it. But the going and going," he paused. "It starts to feel thin after a while, like a coat that is almost warm enough but not quite." She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "My husband Thomas was that way before we married, always restless. He loved Eli and he loved me, I am certain of that, but the restlessness kept pulling at him." She said this without bitterness, with only the gentle melancholy of memory. "He went on the drive because we needed the money. He would have sent it all back." "I believe he would have," Gilbert said, because the room had a quality about it that made him believe it, the tidy poverty of it, the careful love of it, the way things were repaired instead of replaced and organized instead of surrendered to chaos, the way the boy slept confident and safe in the next room. They talked for another hour. He learned that she had grown up in Missouri, that she had come west with Thomas when they married in 1872, that she had been 20 years old and full of ideas about what the frontier would be. He learned that the house had been better when Thomas was alive, that they had been building towards something, that the bad year and then the loss of Thomas had stripped away what savings they had and left her where she was now, doing laundry for 2 of the better-off families in town, taking in mending, keeping a small kitchen garden in the back that produced more hope than food most years. She told him these things not as complaints but as facts, with the same clear-eyed accounting that he had noticed in her all day. He told her about the ranch in Texas where he had learned cattle from the ground up, about the drives north on the Kishom Trail, about the 2 winters he had spent in Wyoming where the cold was a physical force that had opinions about you and expressed them directly. He told her about his father, who had been a hard man and a fair one, who had given back every dollar he owed before he walked away from the land, and how he had understood that only years later as the most significant thing his father had ever done for him, the example of it. When she finally stood and said it was late and she thanked him for everything he had done that day, they were standing close in the small space near the door, and the lamplight was low, and Gilbert Thatcher looked at Marcella Grayson and understood with a simplicity that was almost frightening that he was looking at the most remarkable person he had ever met in his life. He put his hat on and said good night, and she said good night, and he walked out to the barn where he had asked Dabrowski's permission to sleep in an empty stall with Clover rather than pay for a room he could not well afford, and he lay down in the clean hay and stared at the dark above him for a very long time. He was still in Harlan Creek 3 days later. He told himself each morning that he would leave that afternoon. The road to Pueblo was not getting shorter, and Corvin had not said his offer would hold indefinitely. But each morning he found something that needed doing at the house on the south end of the main street, or Eli appeared at the barn door where Gilbert was brushing Clover and said, "Mama wants to know if you would like cornbread." And the decision to leave got pushed back to the afternoon, and then to tomorrow morning. The townspeople of Harlan Creek had opinions about this. He was aware of them in the sidelong glances of Huckett at the general store, and in the way two of the women who attended the church crossed the street with deliberate dignity when he tipped his hat to them. He understood what they were seeing, or what they thought they were seeing, a drifting cowboy spending his time at a widow's house, and he understood that the interpretation was not charitable, and he also understood that the interpretation was not accurate. What was happening between him and Marcella was not the thing the town suspected. It was something quieter and more serious, and ultimately more dangerous to the order of his life. They were becoming friends, genuine and real, the kind of friends where conversation came easy and silence came easier, where you could sit on a repaired front step in the evening and watch the sunset paint the Kansas plain without anyone feeling the need to fill the quiet with noise. He took to buying things at the general store and bringing them in a way that required some careful diplomacy, because Marcella was proud and she was right to be, and she did not want charity. He brought a pound of real coffee and said he had bought too much on the trail and could she use the rest. He brought a new canvas to replace the oilcloth over the window and said he had found a good price on it at the store. He brought a small book of illustrated stories for Eli and said he had come across it at the bottom of his saddlebag and had already read it twice and had no use for it. She accepted the coffee and the canvas. She looked at the book for a long moment and then handed it back and said, "You did not find that in your saddlebag, Mr. Thatcher." "No," he admitted. "I bought it this morning." She looked at him steadily. "Eli does not need gifts from passing strangers." "I know that," he said, "but I would like to give it to him anyway, if you will allow it." Another of those long, considering pauses, and then she said, "I will allow it this once, on the condition that you understand I am not the sort of woman who can be won with coffee and gifts." "I know you are not," he said, and something shifted in the air between them, brief and bright as lightning, because they had both just acknowledged that there was something to be won, or at least something to be considered, and neither of them was quite ready to look at it directly, but neither of them turned away from it either. Eli learned to read his name with Gilbert's help, sitting at the table with the book open between them, Gilbert's work-roughened finger tracing letters while Eli's small finger traced below it, and his mouth moved carefully around the sounds. Marcella stood at the fire and stirred pots and listened and did not comment, but once when Gilbert looked up, she was watching them with a look on her face that was so open and unguarded that she looked away quickly when their eyes met, and the color in her cheeks was not entirely from the fire's heat. On the 5th day, a man came to town. His name was Porter Dill, and he rode in on a bay horse with a fancy saddle and 2 men behind him, and he went first to the saloon and then to the general store, and then he walked down the main street with a proprietorial air and knocked on Marcella's door. Gilbert was around the back of the house at the time, digging out the kitchen garden, which had been half strangled by weeds, and he heard the knock and heard Marcella answer and heard a man's voice, and something about the voice made him set down the spade and move around to the front corner of the house where he could hear without being seen. "Mrs. Grayson," the man was saying in a smooth and practiced tone, "I have come to make you the same offer I made you in the spring, and I think you will find I have been very patient." "Your patience is noted, Mr. Dill," Marcella said, and her voice was composed, but there was an edge under it like cold iron. "And my answer is the same. The house is not worth what you think it is," Dill said. "I am offering you fair market value, more than fair, for the lot. You could take Eli and go back east to your family." "My family is in Missouri, Mr. Dill, and I have no interest in going back to Missouri. I have an interest in staying in the house that my husband built and that my son was born in. Mrs. Grayson, the creek is going to flood again this winter, and that house will not hold. I am doing you a kindness." "You are doing yourself a kindness," she said. "You want the lot because it sits between the general store and the land you already own on the south, and you want to build a warehouse, and you think a widow alone will be easy to pressure. Good day, Mr. Dill." The door closed. Gilbert stood at the corner of the house and listened to Porter Dill stand there for a moment, and then make a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a curse, and then walk back up the street with his boots striking the hard dirt with unnecessary force. Gilbert came around to the front and knocked on the door frame, and Marcella answered it looking composed and slightly pale and furious in the quiet way that was 100 times more alarming than shouting. "Porter Dill," Gilbert said, "you heard." "Yes, I am sorry, I did not mean to eavesdrop." She shook her head. "It does not matter. He has been trying to buy this lot since Thomas died. He knows I have trouble keeping up with the property tax." "Is that a real problem?" A beat of silence. "It has been a difficulty," she said carefully. He could see how much it cost her to admit even that much. He chose his next words with care. "You know I am good for work," he said. "Is there anything that needs doing in town that would pay? I would be willing to split whatever I earn." She looked at him hard. "No," she said. "Marcella." It was the first time he had used her first name, and it landed in the air between them with a quiet weight that surprised them both. He saw her chin lift slightly at it. "Mr. Thatcher," she said, "I appreciate your kindness more than I know how to say properly, but I will not take a man's wages." "Then let me do this," he said. "I will stay through the summer. I will work where I can find it in town and on the surrounding ranches. That will keep me from being a drain on the town's resources and give me something to do with my time. Any money I earn is mine and yours is yours, and if at the end of the summer the tax is short, we will talk about it then. If you never need to call on me, I will ride out to Pueblo in September and we will part as friends, and that will be that." She stared at him. "That is a strange proposal," she said. "I know it is," he said, "but I would rather make a strange proposal than a dishonest one." The long pause, the brown eyes measuring him, going very deep. Then quietly, "Why are you staying, Gilbert?" And there it was, his name in her mouth, and something in his chest turned over like a sleeping animal disturbed. "Because I want to," he said simply. "And because you and Eli are here, and because this is the first place I have been in 4 years that does not feel like a place I am passing through." She was quiet for a moment that felt very long, and then she said, "The Mercer Ranch east of town is looking for extra hands. Mr. Mercer's youngest son told me last week. They are getting the summer hay in. I will ride out tomorrow morning," he said. Gilbert worked the Mercer Ranch through July, riding out at dawn each day and returning in the long summer evenings to the south end of Harlan Creek. He was a good hand, thorough and reliable and easy to work alongside, and Bill Mercer, the patriarch, a weathered man in his 60s who had been ranching the Kansas plains since before the war, told him after the first week that he was the best temporary hand he had hired in several years, and asked if he wanted to make the arrangement permanent through the fall. Gilbert said he would let him know. He took his pay at the end of each week and spent a small portion of it on necessities, and saved the rest in the inside pocket of his bedroll, against no particular plan but with a general sense of purpose. He ate supper at Marcella's house most evenings, which had started as a sometimes thing, and had become a nearly always thing without anyone making a formal declaration about it. And he made himself useful in small ways without making a production of the usefulness, fixing the window frame properly when he found glass at the general store, building Eli a small shelf for his wooden horse and his growing collection of interesting rocks. Eli had attached himself to Gilbert with the uncomplicated wholeness of a small boy who had been missing a masculine presence and had found one he trusted. He saved things to show Gilbert, rocks and feathers, and once a shed snakeskin from behind the wood pile, each offering presented with the solemn importance of a significant gift. Gilbert received each one with equal seriousness, examining them, asking questions, listening to the explanations that Eli always had ready and detailed. Watching them together did things to Marcella's heart that she had not given her heart permission to do, and she was stern with herself about it in the privacy of the night. She had learned, at 22, that the world could take things away without warning and without apology, and she had built her life on the principle that you held things lightly, that you kept one hand free, that you did not lean so far into a good thing that you could not catch yourself when it was gone. But Gilbert Thatcher was very difficult to hold lightly. He was not the kind of man who demanded attention or performed himself for an audience. He was quiet in a way that was full rather than empty, and when he looked at you fully, without the distracted quality that most people had, the sense of them thinking about the next thing while the current thing was still happening. When Gilbert was present, he was entirely present, and that was, Marcella thought, one of the rarest things in the world. In the evenings, after Eli slept, they sat together on the repaired front step or at the table inside, and they talked. They talked about everything, about the nature of the land and how it changed as you moved west, about Missouri and Texas and the particular loneliness of flat places, about what a person owed to other people and what they owed to themselves, about faith and doubt and the complicated business of being human in an indifferent landscape, about books, because Marcella had read more widely than most people in Harlan Creek would have guessed, having grown up with a schoolteacher mother who had brought her books the way other mothers brought their children bread. One evening in late July, a storm came up from the southwest with the sudden theatrical violence that Kansas storms specialized in, and Gilbert, who had been about to leave for the night, stayed at the table across from Marcella while the thunder worked its way across the sky, and the lightning threw the room in and out of sharp white light. And Eli woke and came out scared, and Gilbert talked him through it, explaining the physics of thunder in terms the boy could understand, explaining it as the sky clearing its throat. A large and important clearing of the throat that meant no harm, and Eli had laughed and gone back to sleep. And when Gilbert looked across the table at Marcella, she was watching him with those brown eyes that were in that moment entirely unguarded, and what was in them was something she had not said aloud. He could have said something then. He almost did. But she was still a woman in a fragile position, and he was still a man who had offered her his help and not his heart, and he thought there was a right moment coming, and this was not quite it. August came in golden and hot, and the hay was in, and Bill Mercer asked Gilbert to stay through the fall for the cattle work. Gilbert said yes. He moved his bedroll from the livery loft to a small bunkhouse room that the Mercer Ranch maintained for extra hands, which meant a proper bed and a wash basin, and a place to hang his coat, and which also meant a small increase in his weekly pay. Porter Dill had been to see Marcella twice more during the summer, each time with some new form of the same pressure, and each time she had said no with increasing firmness. But the third time he came, in early August, he brought a document, which he showed her through the door, and which she read standing very still in the doorway, and which turned her face to something white and hard. She did not tell Gilbert about it that evening, but he could see something was wrong in the careful way she moved through supper, and the way she listened to Eli without really hearing, and the fact that she added too much salt to the beans and did not seem to notice. When Eli was asleep, she told him. The property tax on the lot had gone unpaid in full for 2 years because Thomas had died before paying the second year's installment, and she had managed only partial payments since. The county had sent a notice. She had until the 1st of September to pay the full arrears, which was an amount that seemed to her as impassable as a mountain range. Gilbert looked at the notice on the table between them and did some arithmetic in his head. The amount was significant but not impossible. "I have the summer's wages," he said. She looked up at him. "No," she said. "Marcella." "I said no, Gilbert." Her voice was quiet and final. "It is a loan," he said, "against the property, in writing if you want, with whatever terms you choose." "That is not the problem," she said. "Then what is the problem?" She pressed her hands flat on the table. "The problem," she said carefully, "is that I am not certain I can repay it in any reasonable time, and I will not be indebted to a man in a way that I cannot account for, because I have seen what that does to a woman's choices." He understood what she was saying. He understood it completely, and he sat with it for a moment and respected it. "Then what if it is not a loan?" he said. She waited. He looked at his hands on the table, and then looked up at her. And for once his face was not careful or composed but open, which was unusual enough that it changed the quality of the air in the room. "I have been trying to find the right moment for this for several weeks," he said, "and I am not certain there is a right moment, so I will just say it. I do not want to leave in September. I do not want to go to Pueblo or to any other place. I want to stay in Harlan Creek. I want to stay because of you and because of Eli, and because the idea of leaving the two of you and going back to that long, thin life on the trail feels like something I genuinely cannot do." She was very still across the table. "I am not saying this because of the tax notice," he said. "I had been working up to saying it for weeks. The notice just made tonight the night. I am sorry if the timing makes it feel like a convenience." The lamplight was low between them. Outside a nightbird called once and was silent. "Gilbert," she said, and her voice was careful in a way that he recognized as the voice she used when something mattered greatly. "I am a woman with a child and a house that is falling down and a tax debt and a man trying to take my lot and not much else. You are a woman who could run a small country if someone handed you one," he said, "and you know it and I know it." Something moved in her face, quick as the lightning from the summer storm. "That is the best thing anyone has ever said to me," she said, in a voice that was nearly a whisper. "I mean it entirely," he said. She looked at him for a long, long moment. Then she said, "Ask me properly." He almost laughed, not from amusement but from the pure complicated joy of her. He stood up from the table and came around to her side, and he went down on one knee on the swept dirt floor of that broken-down house, and he took her hand, which was warm and slightly calloused at the fingertips from the mending work, and he looked up at her and said, "Marcella Grayson, I believe you are the finest person I have ever known, and I would like to spend the rest of my life making myself worthy of that opinion. Will you marry me?" She looked down at him with those deep brown eyes, and they were bright now, brilliantly bright, and she said, "You will have to ask Eli." He stood. "In the morning," he said. "Yes," she said, and then more quietly, as though saying it to herself as much as to him, "Yes." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, and she turned her hand and pressed her palm briefly against his cheek, warm and real. And the two of them stood there in the lamplight of the Poorest house in Harlan Creek, and the moment was worth more than anything that had happened to either of them in years. In the morning, Gilbert woke early, washed at the ranch bunkhouse, put on his best shirt, and walked into town. He knocked on the door frame at a reasonable hour, and Eli answered, already up and industriously moving his rock collection from one side of the windowsill to the other, and Gilbert crouched down and said, "Eli, I would like to ask you something important." Eli set down a piece of red quartzite and turned his full attention to Gilbert with the gravity the situation deserved. "What is it?" "I would like to marry your mother," Gilbert said, "if that is all right with you." Eli thought about this for a considerably long time. He looked at Gilbert. He looked at the rock in his hand. He looked at the doorway where Marcella was standing just out of direct view, Gilbert knew, because he could hear her trying not to make a sound. "Would you live here?" Eli asked. "I would." "Would you keep fixing things?" "Everything that needed fixing," Gilbert said. "Would you still have time for the rocks?" "Always," Gilbert said. Eli nodded decisively. "All right," he said, with the air of a man who had weighed the evidence and reached a sound conclusion. Gilbert stood and turned, and Marcella was in the doorway with her hand over her mouth and her eyes bright, and he smiled at her. And it was the kind of smile he had not given anyone in a very long time, wide and undefended and full. They were married 3 weeks later, on a Saturday afternoon in the leaning church of Harlan Creek, by the Reverend Fletcher, who was a small and earnest man who performed the ceremony with great sincerity. There were not many guests, because the town had not entirely made up its mind about Gilbert, and because Marcella had not been the kind of woman who collected social connections in hard times. But Bill Mercer and his wife came, and Dabrowski the farrier came, and a woman named Agnes Hale, who had been Marcella's closest neighbor, and who had helped her more than once when things were hardest, sat in the front pew with her hands in her lap, and cried with uncomplicated happiness. Eli stood beside Gilbert as a sort of unofficial best man, wearing his cleanest shirt and a very serious expression, and he held the ring when the Reverend asked for it, and placed it in Gilbert's palm with both hands and the focused care he brought to all important transfers of objects. The ring was a simple silver band that Gilbert had bought from a jeweler in the next town over, riding the 12 miles there and back in one long day. It was not an elaborate ring, but it was solid and true, and it fit exactly right. And when Gilbert slid it onto Marcella's finger, she looked down at it and then looked up at him, and said her vows in a clear, steady voice that did not waver once. His voice did not waver either, though it was a near thing. When the Reverend said he could kiss his bride, Gilbert cupped her face in both his calloused hands and kissed her in a way that was warm and sure and real. And Agnes Hale cried harder, and Eli said, "All right, that is enough of that," in a voice so exactly like his mother's that several people laughed. They moved Gilbert's belongings from the Mercer bunkhouse to the house on the South Street, which required 2 trips on Clover's back and resulted in the house feeling, for the first time, like it was full rather than empty. His saddle went by the door. His extra coat went on the hook beside Marcella's. His copy of a surveying manual and a 2-year-old almanac went on the shelf beside her books. He paid the property tax arrears the following Monday, settling the account with the county clerk, a dry and precise man named Whitfield, who stamped the receipt with visible satisfaction and said that the lot was clear and in good standing. Gilbert carried the receipt home and laid it on the table, and Marcella picked it up and looked at it for a long time, and then folded it carefully and put it in the small tin box where she kept the important papers. Porter Dill Road passed the house twice in the following week, once on each day, and each time Gilbert was visible either on the step or in the yard, and each time Dill's expression went through several calculations and arrived at something unfavorable, and each time he kept riding. On the third occasion, he reined in his bay horse at the step and looked down at Gilbert, who was mending a fence post at the edge of the property, and said, "She tell you about the offer I made?" "She did," Gilbert said without looking up from the post. "Smart woman you got there," Dill said. "The smartest I have ever met," Gilbert said. A pause. "Offer still stands," Dill said. Gilbert looked up at him then, easy and unhurried. "Mr. Dill," he said pleasantly, "this property is no longer in arrears. The house is in better repair than it was in the spring, and my wife has no interest in selling. I would suggest redirecting your energies elsewhere." He went back to the fence post. Porter Dill sat on his horse for another moment and then rode off and was not, after that, a problem. The autumn came in gently, cooling the plains into something bearable and then something beautiful, the tall grass going gold and the sky dropping to a deeper blue. Gilbert's arrangement with Bill Mercer continued, and he worked the fall cattle roundup with the Mercer outfit, coming home in the evenings to the warm certainty of a house that wanted him in it. Living with Marcella was, he discovered, even better than the long evenings on the front step had suggested. She was organized in a way that made the small house function with a kind of quiet efficiency, and she was deeply funny in a dry and unexpected way that surprised him each time, because her humor was always internally consistent and often perfectly timed, and she deployed it with a straight face and watching eyes. He made her laugh too, not always deliberately, and the sound of it was something he would have gone a considerable distance to hear. They were careful with each other in the first weeks, the way 2 people are when they understand that something important is being built and that it requires attention. There were adjustments. He had lived alone for 4 years and had habits that wanted adjusting, a tendency to leave his hat on the table rather than the hook, a way of rising at 4 in the morning that woke her until she adjusted to the rhythm of it, a fundamental silence in the mornings before coffee that she had to learn was not unhappiness, but simply how he came into the day. She had her own adjustments. She had run her household alone and had strong opinions about the order of things that she had to practice sharing, and she was not always easy about receiving help even when she had asked for it, which was something they talked about directly one evening in October, in the way they had discovered they could talk about difficult things, clearly and without cruelty. "I know I am not easy," she said. "I know I hold tight to things." "You hold tight to things worth holding," he said. "That is not a flaw." "It might be a flaw in a marriage," she said. "Then we will figure that out," he said, "together." She looked at him with those brown eyes, and then she reached across the table and took his hand, and that was the end of that conversation. Eli took to the new arrangement with characteristic practicality. He tested Gilbert exactly once, a late October evening when he announced he would not eat his supper and would not go to bed and would not do anything he was asked, and Gilbert sat down across from him at the table and said, in a calm and reasonable voice, "You do not have to eat, and you do not have to go to bed. But you do have to sit here with me for 30 minutes while your mother has some peace, because she has been working since before the sun came up and she deserves 30 minutes of quiet." Eli sat. He sulked magnificently for about 5 minutes. Then, gradually, the magnificent sulk softened, and eventually he said, "What are we going to do for 30 minutes?" "Tell me about the rocks," Gilbert said. They talked about the rocks until Eli's eyes were drooping, and then Gilbert carried him to bed, and when he came back out, Marcella was standing in the kitchen doorway with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup and a look on her face that he had not seen before, and that went through him like warm light. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Only that." She nodded at the doorway where Eli had gone. "Thank you. He is a good boy," Gilbert said. "He is a better boy with you in it," she said, simply and without drama. He crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her, and she leaned into him with her cheek against his collarbone and her hands still around her cup, and they stood there in the lamplight without saying anything for a while. And the house was warm and the wind was moving outside and everything was, for the moment, exactly as it should be. November brought Harlan Creek its first proper cold, a hard frost that finished the last of the kitchen garden and put ice on the water trough each morning. And with the cold came news from the county seat that the railroad survey had been revised, that a spur line was being considered south of its original route, that Harlan Creek might be on the new survey. This news moved through town like a spark in dry grass. Men who had been skeptical of their futures suddenly began to talk again, and the saloon was louder in the evenings, and Huckett at the general store began ordering more stock against the possibility of new customers. Bill Mercer, who had been through several such rumors before and survived their disappointment, remained measured and told Gilbert that he would believe the railroad when he saw tracks, but that in the meantime it did not hurt to be in good standing. Harlan Creek's good standing in this season was partly visible in the small improvements that had been spreading out from one repaired front step and one fixed pump handle on the south end of the main street. Gilbert Thatcher was the kind of man who, when he looked at something broken, saw a specific set of actions that would fix it, and he had applied this quality to the town with the same natural thoroughness he applied to everything else. He had helped a neighboring homesteader shore up a failing barn roof on a Sunday in October. He had spent an afternoon helping Dabrowski the farrier repair the split rails of his corral. He had fixed the church's leaning steeple, which required a full Saturday and a head for heights, while the Reverend stood below and prayed with increasing specificity. The town began to change its opinion of him, slowly, the way towns do, like a ship adjusting course, lots of small individual decisions adding up to a changed direction. He was invited to join the Volunteer Fire Brigade, which was more of a social organization than a firefighting one, but which met monthly and represented a real form of civic belonging. Huckett began to greet him by name when he came in for supplies. Porter Dill stayed away. On a Friday evening in late November, Marcella sat down at the table after Eli was in bed and said, with the careful composure she used for important things, "I believe I am expecting." Gilbert looked at her across the table, and the words arranged themselves in his mind and became real, and something happened to his face that he had no control over, a wide and sudden happiness that apparently surprised Marcella because she laughed, a quick bright sound. "Well," she said, "I was worried you might need a moment." "I do not need a moment," he said, and stood up and came around the table and pulled her gently to her feet and held her, careful and close, with his chin on the top of her head and her hands pressed against his chest. "Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," she said into his shirt. "I am just tired, and sometimes the smell of certain things is intolerable." "Which things?" "Eggs," she said. "Do not cook eggs near me." "Done," he said. "No eggs," she laughed again, muffled against his chest. He held her and thought about the child growing in this woman who was the richest person he had ever known, rich in the way that mattered, in character and in courage and in the particular clear-eyed generosity of spirit that had been the first thing he had noticed about her and would be, he was certain, the last thing he ever forgot. She had walked into that falling-down house one morning in June and cooked him cornbread without being asked and without apology and without asking anything in return, and he had walked in a drifting cowboy passing through, and he had walked out, though it had taken him several months to complete the walking, the richest man he had ever been. They told Eli the next morning, over breakfast, with the careful honesty that was their family's particular style. Eli listened to the explanation of babies and where they came from, to the extent of age-appropriate explanation, with his full and serious attention, and then said, "Will it be a boy or a girl?" "We will not know until it comes," Marcella said. "I would prefer a brother," Eli said. "I will keep that in mind," Marcella said gravely. "Do babies understand about rocks?" Eli asked. "Not at first," Gilbert said, "but you could teach it." Eli considered this with growing interest. "I suppose I could," he said. "I know a great deal about rocks." "You know more about rocks than anyone I have ever met," Gilbert said truthfully. Eli appeared to find this prospect of teaching an acceptable substitute for the direct acquisition of a brother. The winter settled in over Harlan Creek with the seriousness that Kansas winters had. Not the killing cold of the northern plains, but a sustained gray chill, with periodic storms that kept the main street empty for days at a time, and drove everyone indoors to tend fires and stay close. The house held. The repairs of the summer and fall had not transformed it into a palace, but they had made it weather-tight. And with the stove going and the good blankets that Marcella managed with the same careful economy she applied to everything, it was genuinely warm, and warm felt like wealth. Gilbert found winter work at the Mercer Ranch, as there was always enough to do on a working cattle operation regardless of season, and he and Bill Mercer had settled into an easy working relationship built on mutual respect and not a great deal of unnecessary conversation, which suited them both. On the days when weather kept them from outdoor work, they did maintenance in the barn and repaired tack and planned the spring, and Gilbert listened to the older man talk about the land with the attention he gave to everything, and he learned things that would take him years to fully understand. Marcella's pregnancy proceeded straightforwardly, and she managed it with the same practical self-sufficiency she brought to everything, though she accepted Gilbert's help more readily now, which he understood was a significant gift from her, that the accepting was something she was practicing because she knew it was good for both of them. The woman who had been managing alone for 3 years was learning, carefully and willingly, to let someone share the weight. In the evenings of that long winter they read together by the lamp, sometimes aloud, taking turns with whatever book was at hand, and this became one of the true pleasures of Gilbert's life, the sound of her voice reading, the way she moved through a text, the comments she made in the margins of her comprehension that were often better than anything in the book. She had a mind that made connections rapidly and illuminated them in language that was always her own, never borrowed. Christmas, that year, was the warmest Gilbert had spent in a decade. Marcella made a proper meal, pulling from the stores she had been managing carefully since fall, and Agnes Hale came for supper and brought a pie. And the Reverend and his wife came, and the Reverend told a story about his first winter on the Kansas plains that made everyone laugh. Eli received a new set of carving tools from Gilbert, small and well-made, and immediately began planning a carved horse to complement the one his grandfather had made, with the focused ambition of someone who has found the next serious project. January and February passed slowly and completely, the way winter months do in closed and companionable spaces. By March the light was changing and the Kansas plain was making its first tentative moves toward spring, and Marcella's middle was round and firm, and she moved through the house with the particular careful grace of late pregnancy, and Gilbert watched her from across rooms with a love that had grown so large it was almost architectural, a thing you could live inside. On a wet and loud night in the third week of March, 1879, with a late winter storm rattling the windows that Gilbert had properly framed and glazed back in October, Marcella gave birth to a boy. Agnes Hale attended, as she had been a midwife in an earlier part of her life and was entirely competent, and Gilbert waited in the main room with Eli, who had been allowed to stay up because he was old enough and had asked with such serious dignity that it seemed wrong to refuse, and who sat beside Gilbert on the bench by the stove and listened to the sounds from the next room with an expression of extreme concentration. When the baby's first cry came through the wall, Eli looked at Gilbert and said, "That is a very loud baby." "He seems to be," Gilbert said. His voice came out thicker than he intended. Agnes appeared in the doorway and said, "Come meet your son," looking at Gilbert, and he stood up too fast and had to put his hand on the wall. His son. The words were both entirely new and entirely natural, like a word you have known the meaning of for years and suddenly hear in a new language. He went into the room where Marcella lay in the bed, tired and radiant in the way that is specific to women who have just done the most extraordinary thing a person can do, and she had the baby in her arms, a small and red-faced and indignant creature, and she looked up at Gilbert and said, "Come here." He sat on the edge of the bed and she put the baby into his arms and he held him, this small, warm, furious new person who smelled of something ancient and immediate, and his hands, those calloused workman's hands that had handled rope and lumber and iron and leather, held the boy with an instinctive and extraordinary care. "Hello," he said to the baby, in a voice he had not used before, low and wondering. "Say hello to your father," Marcella said to the baby, with a softness in her voice that he had never heard before from her, a new register opened tonight. Eli appeared at the doorway, granted access by Agnes, who had a sensible view of children and family moments, and he looked at the baby with an expression of scientific assessment. "He is very red," he said. "He will settle," Gilbert said. "Is he going to understand about rocks soon?" "Not for some time," Marcella said. "Be patient." Eli looked at the baby with the resignation of someone accepting a long project. "All right," he said. "I will start him simple." They named the boy James Thomas Thatcher. James for Gilbert's father, Thomas for Marcella's late husband, because the name belonged to Eli too, and to the history of this family, and to the love that had built the house that the baby was born in, and because Gilbert Thatcher was not a small enough man to erase the man who had come before him. He was Thomas's wife's husband and Thomas's son's stepfather, and he wore both of these facts with the same straightforward pride he wore everything else he had honestly earned. Spring came in fully after James's birth, and with it, the railroad news became something more than rumor. Surveyors appeared on the edge of Harlan Creek in April, real ones with transits and notebooks and the particular purposeful walk of men on official business, and they camped east of town for a week and took measurements and consulted their instruments, and then rode out south. And 3 weeks later a man from the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway arrived and held a meeting in the church, the only room in town large enough, and told the assembled population of Harlan Creek that the spur line was indeed being planned and that it would run through a point approximately 2 miles east of the current town center. The town erupted. 2 miles east was not nothing. If the depot was 2 miles east, then the future of commerce was 2 miles east, and there was a great deal of immediate and loud debate about whether the town should move toward the railroad, or whether the railroad should build closer to the existing town, the latter being the position of everyone who had property in the existing town, and the former being the position of a smaller number of people who owned land east of town and had been waiting for exactly this moment. Porter Dill, it emerged, owned a substantial parcel 2 miles east of the main street. He had bought it quietly over the past 2 years from farmers who had needed cash and had sold without understanding why Dill wanted flat land east of town. This was the warehouse he had been planning, not on Marcella's lot but at the future commercial center of a town that was going to have a railroad. The injustice of it was not lost on the people of Harlan Creek. A man with money and advanced knowledge, or at least advanced suspicion, had positioned himself to benefit enormously, while the actual working people of the town scrambled to figure out how to respond. Gilbert watched the meeting with a still face and the careful eyes he had trained on useful things, and he thought about the railroad and about Harlan Creek, and about the nature of opportunity and how it distributed itself, which was rarely evenly and rarely without someone's thumb on the scale. Bill Mercer, who had seen several such situations, took a longer view. After the meeting, standing outside the church in the evening air, he said to Gilbert, "The railroad is coming regardless of Dill. The question is what the rest of the town does with it." "What would you do?" Gilbert asked. Mercer looked out at the darkening plain. "I would think about what the railroad needs besides the depot," he said. "The railroad needs beef. It needs supplies for construction. It needs lumber, though God knows where they will get it out here. It needs men who know the land." He looked at Gilbert. "You know the land." "I know cattle," Gilbert said, "and I know rangeland." "Same thing, mostly," Mercer said. Gilbert thought about this on the ride home and continued thinking about it at the table that evening, while Marcella fed James and Eli showed him a new carving in progress, a rough but determined attempt at a hawk, and the lamp burned low and the spring wind moved outside. "What are you thinking about?" Marcella asked over the baby's head. "The railroad," he said, "and what we should do about it." She looked at him with those measuring eyes. "Tell me," he told her. He talked about the ranching and the beef contracts and the opportunity that the railroad represented for someone who could supply cattle reliably and in volume. He talked about the possibility of expanding beyond the Mercer arrangement, of building something real, a herd of their own, land of their own. He talked about it carefully and honestly, including the risks, the capital it would require, the time. She listened without interrupting, James asleep now on her shoulder, her hand moving in slow circles on the baby's back. When he was done, she said, "What would you need to start?" "Land," he said, "and cattle and time." "There is land east of town," she said. "Not Dill's parcels but the section south of them. It is grazing land, good grass, and the owner is a man named Pratt who has been trying to sell it for 2 years because he wants to go back to Ohio." "How do you know that?" he asked. "Agnes Hale is his neighbor's wife's sister," Marcella said. "I know everything that happens in this town." He looked at her for a moment and then laughed, low and genuine, and she smiled at him over the baby's head. And the smile was the one she saved, the one that was not composed or measured but entirely free. They bought Pratt's section in June of 1879, using the combined savings from Gilbert's wages and the small fund that Marcella had accumulated over years of careful management, supplemented by a loan from Bill Mercer, who offered it at fair terms because he trusted Gilbert's judgment, and because he was at an age where he was thinking about what he wanted Harlan Creek to become and who he wanted in it. The loan was real, with terms in writing, and Gilbert paid it down steadily over the following 2 years with the methodical reliability that was his nature. The land needed fencing and watering and improvement, and Gilbert knew how to do all of those things, and in the summer of 1879 he did them, working long days that started before the sun and ended well after it, and coming home in the evenings to the house where the lamp was lit, and something was on the stove and James was growing loud and round, and increasingly interested in everything. And Eli was reading to his brother from the illustrated book about animals, with a gravity and patience that made Gilbert's throat tight. The cattle came that fall, a modest foundation herd bought at good prices because Gilbert knew how to look at cattle and how to negotiate, and they went on to the Pratt section and settled in, and the enterprise had begun. The railroad came to Harlan Creek, or near enough to it, in the spring of 1880. The depot was built at a point 1.5 miles east of the existing Main Street, which was a compromise negotiated by the town council over the course of a winter of contentious meetings, and new construction went up between the depot and the old Main Street like a bridge being built from both sides. Dill made money, as had been inevitable, but the town made too, and the people who had been there before the railroad found that their property and their knowledge and their networks had value in the new order that hadn't been obvious in the old one. Gilbert Thatcher supplied beef to the railroad construction crews through the summer of 1880 and established relationships with the railroad's commissary buyers that led to a continuing contract. The herd grew. A second section of land, adjacent to the first, became available in 1881 when a farming family decided to go further west, and Gilbert bought it with the accumulated earnings of 2 years of careful operation and the satisfaction of a man who is building something real on a solid foundation. Harlan Creek grew too. The railroad brought commerce and commerce brought people, and people brought noise and life and change. New buildings went up on the stretch between the old Main Street and the depot. A new school opened, larger and more properly built than the small room in the church basement where Eli had learned his letters. A doctor arrived and set up a practice in a real office, a development that Marcella received with visible relief, having been in charge of the family's medical decisions with only a worn copy of a home remedy guide and her own considerable good sense. Eli started at the new school in the fall of 1880 and was immediately and thoroughly himself, which is to say he was quiet, serious, good with his hands, and interested in natural things. And the teacher, a young man from Ohio named Cowboy who had arrived with the railroad's secondary wave of settlement, recognized him as the kind of student who needed feeding rather than containing and fed him accordingly. James, meanwhile, grew from a loud red infant into a loud cheerful toddler with his mother's eyes and his stepfather's disposition for looking carefully at things, and he followed Eli around the house and yard with an admiration so complete that Eli, despite his initial reservations about the project, had fully accepted his role as primary influence on his brother's formation and took it seriously. In the summer of 1881, Marcella told Gilbert she was expecting again, and this time he received the news with the ease of a man who has learned to live inside happiness instead of just visiting it. She was glowing and healthy and ferociously capable, managing the household and the garden and the accounts of the ranch operation, which she had taken over because her mathematical mind was significantly better suited to it than his, without slowing down perceptibly. "Are you hoping for a girl?" he asked her one evening. "I am hoping for a healthy baby," she said firmly, in the voice of a practical woman. Then, after a pause, "though a girl would be lovely." The baby arrived in February of 1882, in the same bedroom where James had been born, with the same Agnes Hale attending, who was becoming something of an institution at Thatcher births, and who arrived each time with a calm competence and a jar of her own particular tea for the mother. This time the baby was a girl, small and dark-haired and immediately sure of herself in the way of certain people who arrive in the world already knowing who they are. Eli, who was now 8 and had grown into a thoughtful and observant boy, looked at his new sister with an expression of wonder that was entirely unguarded. "She looks like Mama," he said. "She does," Gilbert agreed. "What will her name be?" James asked. He was 2.5 and had opinions about everything and expressed them at considerable volume. "Ruth," Marcella said from the bed, with the certainty of someone who had known the answer for months. "Ruth Eleanor Thatcher, for Marcella's mother, who had been the schoolteacher in Missouri and who had given her daughter books and the knowledge of how to use them. The name was given with deliberate love, an acknowledgement of what had been passed forward through women across a generation. Gilbert held Ruth in the early morning while Marcella slept, sitting in the chair by the window with the baby on his chest, and the February dark outside going slowly gray, and then pale, and then gold as the sun came up over the Kansas plain. And he thought about the summer day nearly 4 years ago when he had walked into this town with a horse that had thrown a shoe and no particular destination. And he thought about a woman standing in the doorway of a broken house with flour on her cheek, and eyes that saw everything and apologized for nothing. He thought about how a life could turn on a moment so small as a knocked-over pot, and the sound of a woman singing when she thought she was alone. Ruth made a small sound against his chest, and he adjusted his arms automatically, the way he had learned with James, the particular angle that settled a baby into comfort, and she was quiet again, and the sun came up fully and lit the room, and the rest of the house began to stir. Eli was the first out of his room, moving quietly in the early morning way he had always had, and he appeared in the doorway and looked at Gilbert with Ruth and said, in a whisper so as not to wake anyone, "Is she all right?" "Perfect," Gilbert whispered back. Eli nodded and came to stand beside the chair and looked at his sister with a careful, serious expression. "I will teach her about the rocks too," he said. "She will be lucky for it," Gilbert said. The years that followed were good years, the kind that a person stores up against harder times and finds later that there were more of them than they had known, that life in its ordinary daily texture had been extraordinary all along. The ranch grew steadily. The herd expanded onto a third section of land that Gilbert purchased in 1883, and by 1885, the Thatcher operation was one of the established suppliers to the railroad beef contracts and to several markets that had opened with the railroad's expansion through the region. The house on the south end of the main street was eventually replaced. Not torn down, but expanded, carefully and in stages, the way a family grows into its space. Gilbert built onto the east side in 1882, adding 2 bedrooms and a proper parlor. He built a covered porch in 1884 that wrapped around the front and the south side, wide enough for chairs and, in the summer evenings, for all of them to sit in and watch the plain go through its colors. The original structure was absorbed into the larger building like a seed inside a grown tree, still there at the center, still essentially itself. Marcella kept her tin box with the important papers and added to it over the years, receipts and deeds and letters and the children's school reports, and eventually, a small photograph taken by a photographer who came to Harlan Creek in 1885 with new equipment and set up in the church hall and offered portraits for those who wanted them. The photograph showed the 5 of them, Marcella and Gilbert seated, Eli standing behind them at 16 and looking already like the man he was becoming, James at 6 at Gilbert's knee with his father's particular still attention and his mother's sharp eyes, and Ruth at 3 on Marcella's lap with her dark hair and her already determined expression. Gilbert kept a copy of the photograph in the inside pocket of his coat, where the savings had once been, and he was aware that this was both sentimental and exactly correct. The railroad changed Harlan Creek in ways that were not all good, and Gilbert and Marcella saw this clearly and talked about it directly, as they talked about everything. The newcomers brought energy and money, and also brought some rougher elements, and the saloon expanded, and there was more noise and more trouble on some evenings than there had been before. There were land disputes as values rose and old agreements were tested, and there were people who had been early settlers who found themselves crowded by the new commerce in ways they had not anticipated. And then there was the question of the people who had been on the land before any of them. Gilbert had traveled enough and thought enough to understand that the settlement of the plains was not simply a story of opportunity, but also a story of displacement, and he carried this knowledge with a discomfort that did not resolve into anything comfortable. He could not undo what had been done before him. He could conduct himself with honesty in his own dealings, pay fair prices and keep his word, and treat everyone who came to his door with the basic dignity he thought every person was owed. This was not enough, and he knew it was not enough, and he said so once to Marcella, late at night, and she said, "No, but it is what we can do, and we must do it fully." He did it fully. Eli grew into a young man of 20, and then 22, and then 24, and he had become, without any great drama, a naturalist of real ability, the kind of person who could identify a bird by its call and a rock by its grain, and who had begun corresponding with a professor at a university in the East, who had received one of Eli's careful letters about fossil formations he had found on the ranch land, and who had written back with questions that led to a years-long exchange. He worked the ranch alongside Gilbert and knew cattle and land as well as anyone in the county, and he was steady and honest and easy to be around, and Gilbert loved him with the straightforward fullness of a father, which was what he was, whatever the birth record said. When Eli was 23, he brought home a young woman named Clara, the daughter of the Mercer family's neighboring homesteaders, who had blue eyes and a dry wit, and who immediately engaged Marcella in the kind of conversation that goes 3 hours without anyone noticing. And Gilbert watched Eli watch Clara talk to his mother and saw in the young man's face the specific quiet joy of a person whose two most important worlds have fit together. James at 14 was already as tall as Gilbert and had the restless energy of early adolescence directed, mostly, into useful channels, working hard on the ranch in summer and studying hard in the school year with the focused ambition of someone who has decided to make something of himself and is irritated by how much time it is taking. He had decided, with the decisive clarity of his mother, that he was going to study law, and Gilbert had looked at him when he announced this and said, simply, "Then you will," and James had looked back at him with his mother's eyes and said, "I know." Ruth at 8 was exactly who she had been on the first morning, certain and observant and interested in everything, with her grandmother's name and something of her grandmother's gift, a love of language and story that expressed itself in the notebooks she kept, and the elaborate narratives she constructed about every person and creature she encountered. She had her mother's brown eyes and her stepfather's steady quality of attention, and she was going to be, Gilbert thought with a deep and uncomplicated pride, entirely herself. On the evening of their 8th wedding anniversary, in the late summer of 1886, Gilbert and Marcella sat on the wide covered porch of the house that had grown from the Poorest home in Harlan Creek into something solid and warm and real. The children were inside, Eli and Clara visiting for supper, James arguing with his sister about something with the good-natured intensity of siblings who like each other despite their best efforts, and the sounds of it came through the open windows into the evening air. The sky above the Kansas plain was doing the thing it did in August evenings, going from deep blue to copper to rose to purple in a slow theatrical display that never got old, that Gilbert had watched from this porch and from the saddle and from the field for 8 years, and that still caught him the same way every time. Marcella had her coffee and her feet up on the porch rail, and she was looking at the sky with the expression she used when she was not thinking about anything practical, a rare and beautiful look that meant she had allowed herself a moment of pure reception, just taking the world in without managing it. He watched her, 8 years of her face. He knew it in all its versions, the composed and considering face, the laughing face, the tired but continuing face, the sharp with anger face that was brief and specific and always fair, the face she had in the early morning before full wakefulness arrived that was the most unguarded of all, soft and open and younger than her years. He knew the exact way her eyes moved when she was reading something interesting, a slight quickening, a quality of going forward. He knew the way she laughed when something genuinely surprised her, a real laugh, nothing held back, the laugh she had been learning to let out since before they were married. He knew her hands, which had been calloused from mending and now were calloused differently, from the garden and the ranch accounts, and from the mending she still did because she found it satisfying, and because she thought waste was a moral error. He knew the scar on her left wrist from a fall in the winter of 1880, the sound of her voice reading to the children, the particular rhythm of her walk when she was thinking about something. He was aware, sitting beside her on that porch in the August evening, that he was in possession of the best thing his life had produced. Not by himself, not through his own particular virtue, but through the accumulated work of two people who had decided to be honest with each other and to show up every day and to choose this thing over and over, which was what love was, in his understanding, not a single moment of recognition, but every morning after that morning. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, without turning from the sky. "You," he said. She turned to look at him then, and the copper light caught her face, and she looked at him with those brown eyes, deep and clear and knowing, and she said, "Good things, I hope." "The best things," he said. She held his gaze for a moment and then turned back to the sky, and she reached across and put her hand over his where it rested on the arm of his chair, and her hand was warm and real and entirely certain. And they sat together in the long evening light with their children's voices behind them and the plane going gold before them. And the world was full. In the months and years that followed, the story of the Thatcher family continued to unfold in the steady, beautiful way that honest lives do. Eli married Clara in the spring of 1887, in the same leaning church that had since been properly straightened and repaired, with the same Reverend Fletcher performing the ceremony, older now and slightly more tremulous but no less sincere, and Gilbert stood beside Eli and put the ring in his hand with both hands, the same way Eli had once put a ring in his, and the moment moved through him like music. James went east to study law in 1889, when he was 18, taking the train from the Harlan Creek depot on a September morning with a worn suitcase, and his mother's clear eyes and his stepfather's calloused handshake. And Gilbert stood on the platform and watched the train go and was aware that this was the right thing, and that the rightness of it did not make the watching easy. He came home for Christmas and grew each year into a person who was recognizably himself, and also more than he had been. And eventually, when he was 25 and had his law degree and had worked in Topeka for a year, he came back to Kansas and set up a practice in a town 20 miles from Harlan Creek that was large enough to need a lawyer and small enough to need a good one. Ruth kept her notebooks and filled them steadily through childhood and into a girlhood that was characterized by reading and thinking and asking questions that stumped people twice her age. And when she was old enough to go to the new women's college in the East, Marcella sat with her at the table and said, "Tell me what you want." And Ruth said, "To go and learn and come back and make something." And Marcella said, "Then go," and she went. The house on the South Street, expanded and solid, with its wide porch and its proper windows and its pump that never stuck, became the kind of house that people referred to as a landmark, not because it was grand but because it had endured and because everyone knew whose it was and what it had been and what it had become. The tin box of important papers was joined by a second box, and then a shelf of them, the accumulating record of a life that kept producing things worth keeping. Gilbert's hair went gray at the temples, and then more broadly gray, and his hands stayed calloused and his eyes stayed still and careful, and he worked the ranch until his body made honest protests about the harder work, and then he took on more of the managing, and less of the physical labor and hired good men who appreciated fair treatment and stayed because of it. Marcella's hair went silver at 50 with a beauty that she accepted without self-consciousness, because she had never been the kind of woman who fought time, only the kind who used it well. She kept her accounts and her garden and her reading and her coffee that was no longer mostly chicory but real, full coffee from the general store that had grown into something properly stocked, and she sat on her porch in the evenings with the woman she had become, and was entirely at peace with the accounting. On an evening in the fall of 1900, Marcella and Gilbert sat together on the porch in the long gold light, and there were grandchildren in the yard because Eli and Clara had 3 of them by now, and they visited often. 2 boys and a girl. The girl named Marcella, which had been Clara's idea, and which had made the elder Marcella press her lips together hard and look at the ceiling for a moment before gathering herself. James had married a woman named Helen, sharp and warm and exactly right, and they had a son who was 1 year old and lived 20 miles away but who already had his grandmother's eyes. Ruth was still east, teaching at the women's college now, writing letters home that were detailed and alive, and that Marcella read aloud to Gilbert after supper because they were too good to keep to herself. The grandchildren ran in the yard in the last of the light, and their voices were the voices of children running, that particular high free sound, and a dog that Eli and Clara's eldest had brought was running with them and adding its own commentary to the noise. Gilbert watched the children and felt the full weight and beauty of the accumulated years, the impossible richness of it, this life that had grown from a thrown shoe and a knocked-over pot, and a woman standing in a doorway with flour on her cheek. He looked at Marcella beside him, silver-haired and clear-eyed, and she looked back at him with the deep brown eyes that had first seen him on a June morning in 1878, and she said, in the direct and unhurried voice that was as familiar to him as his own heartbeat, "You are staring again." "I am," he agreed. "What is it this time?" He thought about it genuinely, because she always deserved a genuine answer. "I am thinking about the first day," he said, "the step and the cornbread and the pump handle." She looked at him for a moment, and then she smiled, the real one, the one she saved, the one that was not composed or careful but entirely free. "I was terrified of you," she said. "Did you know that?" He was surprised. "You were terrified of me. You were the most composed person I had ever seen." "I was terrified," she said, "because you were the first person in 3 years who looked at me like I was still a whole person, and not just a problem to be managed or a pity to be felt. I did not know what to do with that." He took her hand, which he had done 10,000 times, which was still the most natural thing in the world. "What did you decide to do with it?" "I decided to give you cornbread," she said, "and see what happened." He laughed, a real laugh, low and warm, and she laughed too, and the children in the yard looked up at the sound of their grandparents laughing on the porch and went back to their running without concern, because that was a familiar and good sound, the sound of the world being in order. The sun went down over the Kansas plain in its extravagant way, gold going rose going purple, the same sky it had always been, and the lamp in the window behind them came on where someone inside had lit it, and the smell of supper came through the open door, and Harlan Creek moved around them in its evening rhythms, the sounds of a town that had grown and changed and survived and kept going, the way towns did, the way people did. Gilbert Thatcher held his wife's hand in the autumn evening and thought about all the roads that had not led here, the ones he might have taken, the right turn instead of the left, the stay instead of the go, the million small choices that had added up to this particular and irreplaceable life. And he thought, as he had thought many times before, that a man who rode into a town because his horse threw a shoe and walked out years later with everything worth having was the luckiest man he had ever heard of. Not lucky in the way of a man who finds gold or wins at cards. Lucky in the way of a man who, at the exact right moment, knocked on the right door and was answered. She had been standing in the Poorest house in Harlan Creek on the morning he arrived, and she had looked at him with nothing to offer but her dignity and her good cooking, and her undefeated intelligence, and her love for a small boy who saved rocks and a carved wooden horse. And he had walked into that house a drifting cowboy with nothing ahead of him but the long, thin road. He had walked out, eventually, by way of 22 years of mornings and evenings and hard work, and honest conversation and children and grandchildren, and a life so full it had never once since felt thin, the richest man alive. The lamplight from the window lay gold across the porch boards, and the evening star came out above the plain, and Marcella squeezed his hand once, the particular squeeze that meant she was happy, and Gilbert Thatcher squeezed back. Outside, a grandchild laughed at something the dog had done, bright and sudden as a struck bell, and the sound of it rose into the violet Kansas sky and stayed there, the way good sounds do, long after the evening had gone still.